Hey, this is Will with Lost Visions Performance. Today I'm going to give you a brief overview on what it takes to do the timing cover reseal on your Scion FRS, Subaru BRZ, or Toyota GT-86. It's not really a difficult job to do, it just is time consuming. The two most difficult portions that you have to do on this will be cleaning off all the old gasket material from the engine side and also the cover side, making sure that you have all that good to go, and removing the crank pulley. The crank pulley itself doesn't take any special puller to remove, but getting the crank bolt off can be a little bit difficult sometimes. So we'll give you a little walkthrough on what we went through on getting this one resealed, and hopefully it helps you figure out what you need to do for yours. Alright, getting started on the timing cover reseal on our BRZ. First thing what we're going to do is remove all the intake setup. So all we have to do for that is there's a total of 3 10mm bolts to pull this box out of here. We'll undo this clamp going over to the sound composer. We'll go ahead and leave that all in there. Undo the clamp to the throttle body, undo our crankcase ventilation hose, and just unplug the mass airflow sensor. We'll pull this whole setup out of here. It does kind of lip up under this duct here, but it'll pull back pretty easy and come out of there. Then we are going to remove our serpentine belt and our upper radiator hose. You do not have to remove the upper radiator hose, but it just makes it a little bit easier when you're trying to get your cover back in afterwards. Less stuff to have to move around. So we did drain some of the coolant out of this one already. We probably will still lose a little bit more once we get that hose off, but that's okay, just have something under there to catch that. And we will also remove the oil filter so it can drain out any of its oil, because it is part of the timing cover. So we'll just get that started draining while we go ahead and take care of all this other stuff up top here first. Alright, we got all our air box and intake hose set up out of the way. Got it all off at the composer side. We have our serpentine belt off. We have our upper radiator hose off. What we're working on now, well, actually I went ahead and broke loose the bolt on the crank pulley. That one is a 22mm. I used a special tool. This one, it's specifically for breaking loose crank bolts. It goes on there. You're able to sledgehammer on this side, breaks them loose nicely. Most likely you don't have that. Would be a nice investment though if you find one. One thing you can do, which I've had to do on some of the other ones previously, is remove these lower bolts from this core support, upper support, and remove these upper ones up here, and you'll be able to move this forward enough to get most impacts in there with the short socket. So most likely that's what you'll have to do. There is other ways you can go about it. In some of the standard transmission cars, you can put it in gear, lock the brake, and sometimes be able to get a breaker bar on there to break that loose. Most of the time it still doesn't really work very well, so impact is usually the best way, unless you have one of those hammer impacts, which work very nicely. Anyways, we got that, and we got our serpentine belt off. What we're on to now is going to go ahead and remove the alternator setup with its bracket and the tensioner. We do have to pull this idler off first, because there's some bolts that go in behind it, and we will remove our dipstick, and then we're on to disconnecting all our electrical. Everything for the camshaft phasers, camshaft sensors. These ones are just lead ones for the O2 sensor wires, and then the oil pressure sender wires. So I have to disconnect these and everything. On this side we will undo these brackets from the timing cover. Instead of trying to get all the connectors to release, we'll just unbolt those. Less damage that way. Alright, we got the alternator removed from the setup, and the bracket as well, with the tensioner and the idler. When you remove your alternator, we just have this one unbolted and just set up over here. There's 2 12mm bolts that hold it in, and then you can get that up out of the way. You may have to pry it up a little bit, because this cinch nut right here does tie it close to that bracket to keep it tight. So you might have to pry that up a little bit to get it out of there. And then there will be a total of 3 14mm bolts. Sorry, 4 14mm bolts, sorry about that. They both go into the front and then down through the back right here. This one's kind of in an odd setup, and on the bolt heads they use are real short. So it is sometimes better if you unbolt the 4 10mm bolts from the throttle body, just to gain a little better access to that one, just to make sure you don't strip it off, because they are pretty tight. So we have all that off there. Like I said, you do have to remove the one idler pulley to get back to the other 14mm bolt behind this one. That one is also a 14mm to remove that. And we've started doing some cleaning on our front cover area here, just to so when we get it pulled apart, it'll be less that we have to try to clean up with this open. We will still have to go in and scrape some of the old form in place gasket to clean all that off, but at least we won't have all that extra dirt and everything in there, so a little less possibility of contamination. So now, as I said before, we will start removing our wiring and undo our brackets for all the wiring holders. Already got that off. We have our crank pulley pulled off. Once you get that 22mm bolt off, it just slides out. Be careful not to lose the woodruff key on the crank. This one's kind of staying on there, but when you go to put it together, just make sure it's still in the correct spot. Alright, we have all of our wiring out of the way. These ones are all just take regular standard squeeze clips. Sometimes they might be a little bit stuck on there, so it might be better to push down on them, release the tab, then pull up on it. Just be careful with those. There's a couple of them we did unbolt for the brackets, going to various spots on the timing cover. You can squeeze these and pull them away, but a lot of times it's better to just try to unbolt that. These like to break off. So we got all that all undone. One thing I did forget about, I totally bypassed, we did have to pull the pulley off of the water pump because it comes up and it's very hard to get to these two bolts right there for the lower part of the timing cover. Usually you break that loose with the serpentine belt on and it comes off pretty easy. There's 3 10mm bolts. If you did bypass that, like I forgot about it, there's 3 extra holes in the water pump pulley. You can put 2 bolts or 2 screwdrivers in there, brace it with the pry bar, and then break them all loose and pull them off. They're not that tight. So, and we did also go ahead and pull our crank seal out, just because it's easier to do when the cover's still bolted down. That we're not trying to mess with it when it's off. Yeah, it doesn't matter either way. They pop out really easy. You just get a screwdriver or a pry bar in there or a seal puller, and they just pop right out. So we just went ahead and pulled that one out now. So pretty much all we have to do now, we have, like I said, we have all our wiring undone, our filters off. There's a bunch of 10 and 12mm bolts holding the cover on. Just make sure you're thorough. Check all of them over, make sure you have them all off, and then we'll be able to start wiggling the timing cover forward. Alright, so we have the timing cover off finally. And you are removing it to wiggle it out, make it a little bit easier. There's one bracket over here we removed that goes on for the bottom bolt for the airbox. It's that little bracket right there. And then we did remove the coolant reservoir. That way we could pull it back a little bit more. And we undid these 2 bolts for the water neck. That way we just had a little bit of flexibility on this to get it moved out of there. You do want to make sure that you have something under the car because you will drip some oil from around all that stuff when you get the cover off finally. There is 4 different types of bolts that hold the cover on, so you want to be careful to put them back in the right area. They're not real complicated. You got your real long ones here. Those go on the thicker portions of the cover, obviously, and these are the most common ones. And then you have 3 short 10mm bolts that go through the center portion of the timing cover. And then you have these 2 long 10mm bolts that go on the very sides in between the cams. So, pretty self-explanatory when you're doing it. All the short ones go on the little narrow ledge like that. All the thicker ones go in behind the thicker sides. So all the perimeter bolts are 12mm, and then all those center ones are 10mm. So when you're doing it, make sure you got them all out. There is a lot of bolts that cover this, and you don't want to crack this thing trying to pull it off. You want to be careful with it. You do have to pry them a little bit, but it shouldn't be too bad. They do kind of stick with the silicone, kind of glues them on, but just be gentle, wiggling back and forth on it. They give you a pretty decent spot right about here between the cover and the lock piece that you can actually get in and pry on it a little bit. But you know, don't go too crazy on it. It does have a few dowels that it sits on, so it does more or less need to come off flat. So now we did do some pre-cleaning on it before we took it all apart. We are going to do some more to obviously remove all the old gasket material. This one had been redone previously by somebody else. You can see they used the gray silicone. All the Toyota and Subaru, they use the black sealant on these ones. So that has been redone. And you want to make sure to replace all the O-rings that go in here as well. You get a few of those. We got those all straight from Subaru. That and a new crank seal. Gotta be careful with that. There's another one right there. That one came off and stayed on the cover itself. But now we're gonna do some cleaning. Clean off the old gasket material from this side. Clean it off from the cover side. Get our new sealant on there. Replace our O-rings. And start getting it back together. Alright, so we got everything cleaned up on here. Got our mating surface all cleaned up. Hit it with some brake clean to remove any oils. Went ahead and replaced our O-rings. Those 3 there. Main one for oil pickup. Alright, we got a thin coat of gray RTV on this one. You don't have to go real crazy on it, just a real light thin bead. Alright, starting to go back together. We got the cover all back on. Like I was trying to say earlier, with the sealant on these, just do a thin skin around the whole outside of it, obviously. Don't make it real thick. You only need just a real thin amount on there, and then let it sit up. I usually let it sit for about 10-15 minutes or so before you put it on, before you start tightening it all up. That way it ensures it doesn't all just squeeze out. It actually builds up a little bit of an actual seal in there, and then you don't want to go too much. So as you see, like you see the little bit of it squeezed out here, not very much at all. That's all you want to see. You don't want to see big gobs of it hanging out, then that means you have that same amount on the inside, which is not good. That's not doing anything to make it seal any better. That's just running possible risk of getting any type of sealant down in the engine, where it could cause later issues. So that's one of the issues that happens with some of these that were done under warranty through Toyota and Subaru. People redoing the covers on these, just banging them out as quick as they can. They smear a crap load of that sealant on there, torque it all down, send it out, and they end up having worse leaks than before, and some of them were actually ingesting some of the pieces of silicone through there and causing more issues afterwards. So if you're doing this yourself, you can definitely make sure that that doesn't happen. And we then did install our new crank seal. If you get these ones good and greased up, they press in pretty easily, so nothing too crazy. You don't have to use any special driver or anything. Just get them lined up and work its way around. I pushed it on with the back of a screwdriver around there and worked its way in pretty good. Got our dipstick tube back in, get some of our electrical hooked back up. So we're going to finish up with the electrical on this side, start getting our brackets put back in so we can bolt back up our throttle body. Got our hoses and everything back on, alternator back on. So this portion of it goes really quick. The longest portion that takes to do anything on this is actually cleaning off all the old sealing surface and getting the crank pulley off. Other than that, this job really isn't that bad. Alright, we're almost there with it. Got all our electrical hooked back up, got our crank pulley back on. On this one we tightened it with the same one we used to remove it, the hand impact. We tightened it however you were able to remove yours. Got our water pump pulley back on, got our belt back on, oil filters back on, all electrical on this side. Reinstalled our bracket for the airbox on this side, reinstalled our coolant bottle, reinstalled our coolant filler neck, got our hose back on, got our bracket in with alternator and everything, obviously. So now all we got to do is get our intake and airbox back on, fill back up the coolant, top off our oil, hook back up our negative battery cable. Alright, so everything is back together. We went ahead and gave it a good hot run. Took it around the block. There is no leaks. It did take a while to burn everything off the exhaust. Even once you get it all cleaned off, this one had a pretty good leak beforehand, so it was all coated all the way back. We wiped it off as much as we could, but it still burns off a lot. Anyways, so be aware of that. So do that once you get it to obviously top off all your fluids when you're done. Check your oil, top off your coolant, make sure it burps properly depending on how much you drained out of it. Double check everything, any connections you have, make sure nothing's in the way of any of the belt routing, make sure the belt is routed correctly, make sure none of the wiring is able to rub or anything like that, and check your coolant level, make sure it stays good. Also make sure it stays good in the coolant recovery tank. So just do that. Like I said, I always say double check everything, but really do that, it could save you a lot later on. Alright, so that was it for resealing the timing cover on this Subaru Boxer engine. Like I said, this is the one for the Toyota GT-86, Scion FRS, and Subaru BRZ. It is similar to some of the other newer Subarus, but we're not covering that on this one. Like I said, it's not a real difficult job, it's just time consuming. The book time for it is 5.2 hours. Depending on how many of these you've done, you can get it done quicker, or it could take you a little bit longer. Any job is always one bolt away from turning into a nightmare. This one went pretty quick. So it was about a total of 4 hours of work, I would say, to get it totally done. We've done them before, so it's not that bad. Like I said, the hardest parts is just getting all that stuff cleaned off of the cover side and the engine side, so you can make sure you have a good seal back when you put it together. Couple key things: be careful with all the silicone. You don't want to overdo it. It's really easy to overdo it, and it can cause you a lot of issues. Do a light bead on there, let it sit for, I usually let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. Go ahead and put it on, get everything torqued, get all your accessories on. You shouldn't have any issues. Always use a new crank seal, and always replace the O-rings behind the timing cover as well. That's something that some people will skip on that, and you'll regret that later. So hope this video helps, and thanks for watching. And got a thin skin of gray LPV on this one. Hold on. Hey, this is Will with Lost Visions. Oh, I can't talk.